Blue skies and rainbows and sunbeams from heaven are what I can see when my Lord is living in me. I know that Jesus is well and alive today. He makes his home in my heart. Nevermore will I be all alone, since he promised me that we never would part. Green grass and flowers all blooming in springtime, all works of the Master I live for each day. I know that Jesus is well and alive today. He makes his home in my heart. Nevermore will I be all alone, since he promised me that we never would part. Tall mountains, green valleys, the beauty that surrounds me, all make me aware of the one who made it all. I know that Jesus is well and alive today. He makes his home in my heart. Nevermore will I be all alone, since he promised me that we never would part. Brent?
Good afternoon. Appreciate you all being here. Let me tell you the genesis of this lesson and several that I plan to do on Sunday nights. A young single mom from our congregation approached me a couple weeks ago and said, I have a sermon request. And I said, okay, I like sermon requests. What do you have that you suggest? And she said, I would love for you to talk about the parents' responsibility to teach their children God's word and how we can do it more effectively. And that is an important subject. We've got, I think, about close to 50 young people here in this congregation now, and a lot of young families that have come our way over the last several years. And I just love children. One of the reasons I want to go to heaven is because that's where all the children will be, right? No children in hell. It's one of the things that makes it hell is there's no kids there. And we are blessed with many little ones so fresh from God that we can shape their hearts for good and for God. And so what I decided to do was to make a copy this afternoon of a lesson that I put together for a series that I do in congregations around the country on home and family. The first lesson is just the lesson on honor father and mother, and the second one is how do you practically instill honor in children. And I've got about 50 copies on the back, and I'd encourage you all to pick one of those up on the way out. Rather than do a whole sermon on honor father and mother, which I have done here fairly recently, if you'd like to hear the whole sermon, it's done several years ago. You just go to kirklandchurchofchrist.org, which is our old Congregate site. That's where we keep all our archives. And then you put in the search bar, honor father and mother, and this lesson will pop up. But in order to sort of set the stage for the lesson tonight on how to instill honor, I want to go ahead and just do a brief review, if you will bear with me with that. Moses said in Exodus chapter 20, verse 12, that is the fifth of the 10 commandments. He says, honor your father and your mother, that your days may be prolonged in the land which the Lord your God gives you. I want you to notice the condition that he put on this fifth commandment. It's unique. And then in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul writes in Ephesians, I want you to remember that these letters were circulated among the churches and read to the assembly. And I think it's neat that Paul in this letter stops to the children that he assumed would be in the assembly, not off somewhere else. And he says, okay, this is for you, children. It's the Apostle Paul. He says, you make sure you obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Then he quotes this statement of Moses from the book of Exodus, honor your father and mother. He calls it the first commandment with promise. What is there so unique about this commandment that it is the first commandment with promise? And what exactly does that mean? Well, I'm going to answer that a little bit later in my introductory comments. But certainly, this is a key foundational principle that is just especially relevant and important today as we deal with what many educators refer to as a culture of disrespect. In this culture of disrespect, we as people who believe in God and are striving to raise our children to believe in God, and one day we can have this wonderful reunion forever in heaven, we're told that parents and godly grandparents are supposed to cultivate an attitude of respect. This is also true with our Bible class teachers, male or female, when we teach our children here at Kirkland in Bible class. And let me suggest that one of the first places that I think this ought to begin, that is often overlooked, is do not allow even nonverbal defiance or disrespect. Maybe I should say especially nonverbal defiance. One of the strongest passages in the Bible, has the strongest language in it, is Proverbs 30 and verse 17. Listen to this. The eye that mocks his father and despises to obey his mother, the ravens of the valley shall pick it out, and the young eagle shall eat it. Ooh. He's just talking about a rebel, a 3,000-year-old juvenile delinquent who's sporting a tude and shows this terrible disrespect toward his mother and his father. That's how God feels about it. I remember when my kids were young, I would say, I want you to know this insistence that your mom and dad have toward you treating us respectfully, always, has nothing to do with some big ego on our part. This has to do with the fact that we're going to have to stand before God and give account one day in judgment as to how we raised you. And God has told us that this is what we're supposed to do, because there's rank in the family, and you need to show honor toward us in order to honor God. And one of these days, you're going to have kids, and you're going to want your children to show proper respect and honor to you also. This is not a matter that is optional. It doesn't matter what kind of behavior your friends' parents allow among your peers. In our home, we value each other, we value God, and most importantly, we respect one another. Parents must cultivate this attitude of respect and role model this before the children. Moses says in Leviticus 19 and verse 3, fear every man his mother and father. And by the way, in the Old Testament, it was a capital crime to strike or to assault your parent. And so I think the best way to nip this in the bud is to watch the tone of voice, especially watch and nip in the bud any kind of talking back. You call your children, don't allow them to say yeah or what. How about yes, Dad, yes, Mom? Don't allow your children to ignore you, as they will if you allow them to ignore you. To ignore someone when you're talking to them, it's disrespectful. And just call them out on it. And when we call you to dinner, we expect you to come the first time without us having to call you again and again and again. You disrespect your mother who worked so hard to put a nice meal on the table for us. And you do it without yelling. And there's no reason for you to yell in the home. It's degrading and disrespectful to yell at one another. So you model in the home respectful behavior. And you don't tolerate even a bad tone of voice, and especially some sort of rolling of the eyes. Let's assume that your child misbehaves, and so you send them to their room. And they technically obey. They get up, they kind of move their chair back, and kind of with a bad tone of voice and a bad facial expression, take the chair and maybe sort of slam it back up against the table and stomp down the hall and then slam their bedroom door shut. Well, you told them to leave the table and go to their bedroom. Technically, they did what you said, but is that a respectful way to respond to that request? Sophie's going, no, you know what would happen, don't you, Sophie, if you tried that? Yeah, same thing that would have happened in my house. And so what do? This is the part where I think so many parents fail, is you go back and you knock on the door and you say, well, thank you for technically doing what your mom and dad asked you to do, but that wasn't appropriate, and I think you know why. So let's try it again. So you role play. You have them go back, sit down at the table, and then the child may say, well, I don't know what you mean. Say, how about this? I'm going to ask you again, and you're going to say, yes, sir, or yes, dad. And then you're going to stand up, and you're going to very nicely put the chair back, and then you're going to nicely, don't stomp, walk down the hall, and then you're going to go into your room, and you're just going to close the door normally. None of this slamming the door because you're upset that you had to go to your room in our house. You got it? Yes, Dad. Would you please excuse yourself and go to your room? Yes, Dad. She gets up, walks down the hall in a normal kind of cadence, walks into her room, closes the door. Then, very importantly, you go back and you praise the child. Good job. That's exactly what we had in mind. That wasn't so hard. You're happier, we're happier, but most importantly, we honor God because we showed respect to one another in our home. It's just so important to train your children, not just teach them. And a part of training is role playing. Next Sunday night, Lord willing, we're going to talk about the difference between teaching and training. I'm going to give you lots of examples about how this works. It's an important key, really important key. Discipline attitudes first when your children are really young. And generally speaking, the behaviors will take care of themselves. If you go down to juvenile hall or you talk to some vandal, I've never known somebody who's in a situation like that who's not sporting a tude and who's got a bad attitude. And what they're doing with their hands and what they're saying with their disrespectful words is just a ladle from the heart. That's why they're talking the way they are. It's a heart problem, not just a behavior problem. And if you focus on the behavior without trying to get back toward the heart, you're just dealing with the symptom. And oftentimes you just make the child mad and you don't accomplish anything. It just escalates. Discipline attitudes first. And behaviors will take care of themselves, at least most of the time. Honoring parents is actually, the Bible says, the very foundation of an orderly society. And an indication that a society is in decay and is going downhill fast is when you have this attitude of disrespect that we have to live with today. My sister was a school teacher her whole life, Crystal. My youngest sister, she never married. And she loved teaching. And there were a variety of reasons why she retired early, but one of the main ones was that it just wasn't any fun anymore because it was so much focused on discipline rather than teaching. And she couldn't get the parents to back her when she was trying to help their kids in having discipline in the classroom. And so she just said, enough. Very sad. And we want to make sure that our children here at Kirkland stand out because they're respectful, obedient children. And it's one of the ways we can be a magnet to draw other people to the Lord's church. It's really significant that it is listed fifth in order of the Ten Commandments. Now, I don't have time to go into this in much detail, but just let me show you the Ten Commandments here. The first four are vertical. They have to do with your relationship with God. And then the second grouping, or the last six, have to do with your relationship with your fellow man. It makes sense. First, you get your relationship with God right. Now you're in a position to get your relationship with your fellow man right. And what is the first foundational thing that we're told after God starts talking about the basic commandments that deal with how we relate to one another? First thing, fifth commandment, honor your father and mother. Teach your children respect for authority at home. And a part of that is teach them thou shalt not murder. Why? Because we're supposed to have respect for human life. Every human life is precious. And then he says, teach them not to commit adultery. Why? Because we need to learn to respect our marriage vows. And then he says, teach them not to steal. Why? Because we're supposed to have respect for each other's property. That's why. And teach them not to bear false witness against one another. Why? Because we're supposed to love and respect truth. And here, even in the Old Testament, he says, and don't covet your neighbor's wife either. Don't covet your neighbor's possessions. Don't be envious of what they have. Because you need to be concerned about your thoughts and your heart. So don't commit adultery with your neighbor's wife, and don't even think about it. Don't wish you could. Don't have that kind of heart. And the irony about all of this and how it all fits together so beautifully is, as I mentioned this morning, the Bible says covetousness is idolatry. So if you covet your neighbor's possessions, you're guilty of covetousness, and that becomes your God, then you violated the very first commandment, which says you should have no other God before me. So you violate the 10th, you violated the first, and they all fit together perfectly. The order of the 10 Commandments is very significant. And I plan this year to delve into the significance of each one of these 10 Commandments in greater detail and some future lessons, because even though we don't keep the Sabbath today, 9 of these 10 commandments are all repeated in the New Testament because they're the foundation of basic morality. And I think every Christian ought to know them, and every parent ought to teach their children what these are and have them lay it up in their hearts. So why is honoring parents so foundational? Well, if you don't learn honor and respect for your parents at home, where are you going to get it for your teachers in the classroom? Or the policemen on their beat? Or even the respect for elders and their authority in a local church? Or later, respect for your own marriage vows? Average marriage in this country only lasts 8 years. That is just pathetic. Terrible breakdown of the family, and it all starts in this culture of disrespect. Again, have you ever known a vandal or delinquent who honored his or her parents? I submit to you, it just doesn't happen. It's the breakdown of the home that is just causing so many problems in our society. And it starts with honor father and mother. And why is it so foundational? If children are not taught to respect us, whom they can see, how do we expect them to respect God, whom they cannot see, right? So, why is this the first commandment with promise? What did Moses say? If you honor father and mother, you'll live long on the land which I've given you. So, the promised land was given based upon the condition of faithfulness. He told them, if you're faithful to the law and to the covenant, then you will keep this land forever. But if you are unfaithful and you bow down to other gods and you become immoral and you reject the law and the covenant that God gave you at Mount Sinai, God says, I'm going to send you into captivity and you're going to lose this land. So, he says at the very beginning, if you're careful to teach your children to respect mom and dad in the home, the implication is it's much more likely then that they'll learn to respect God in the covenant, and therefore you will live long upon the land which I've given you because you won't lose it for disobedience. Most children, male and female, view their concept of the Heavenly Father through the lens of their earthly father. And if they love and honor and respect their earthly father, and then you start talking to them about their heavenly Father, then it's so much easier for them to respect God and everything else that goes along with it. So that's why this is the first commandment with promise. And that's why priority job one for a parent, the most important thing, is you teach them to respect you first. And then from there, they learn to respect God, and then their teachers, and then life, and other people's property, and their marriage vows, and the elders, and everything else that goes along with it. And this is wisdom from 3,400 years ago that God gave us in his first theocracy. So, wow, honor father and mother. Really important. But a lot of times I'd preach this sermon, and people come up to me afterwards and say, okay, I agree, it's important, but how do I go about doing that on a day-to-day basis? I mean, how do I pull that off on Monday morning? Well, I thought you'd never ask. So how do you instill honor in your children? I want you to notice Proverbs 19, verse 18. Discipline your son while there is hope, and do not desire his death. I want you to notice this. Doesn't it say, discipline your child or your son while there's hope? Doesn't it imply that if you wait too long, it may become hopeless? I think that is an implication, isn't there? So make sure you do this quick, or you may lose that opportunity to do it when it's much easier. And this is something that has to do with life or death, heaven or hell. Because again, if you wind up having a rebellious, disrespectful child in the home, and that continues, you're going to wind up losing their soul. And you're certainly not going to have a family that is exemplary and a blessing the way God intended. So all of this is, of course, a work in progress. And you have to pray about these things and bathe your children in prayer and just make this such an important top priority. But it makes it easier if you just recognize the one thing that our society does not recognize, and that is that this principle of honor in the home is vital to everything. Solomon warns, the father of a scoffer hath no joy. Boy, that's for sure. You have a child that's a rebel or disrespectful or sarcastic to you, it just breaks a parent's heart. It was Shakespeare who said, sharper than a serpent's fang is a thankless child. And that's exactly right. But you know, parents, you need to teach your children about what's involved in being thankful and teach them to say thank you. And don't treat them in a way where they have this attitude of entitlement, the opposite of being grateful, which is so typical in the world around us. So, how do you instill honor? Well, these are just some miscellaneous thoughts that I jotted down, and I think they're pretty self-explanatory. Let's just go through these quickly. How do you instill honor? Well, first of all, you treat them with honor. You treat them with respect. 1 Peter 2 and verse 17 says, show proper respect to everyone. And even though the parents here are trying to raise up the children and the children are down here, they're still your spiritual equal as far as having inherent value before God. And so you practice the golden rule with your children. You need to think of your children as much as possible as just sort of little adults. I mean, how would you like to be treated if the roles were reversed? So a part of that, it seems to me, is you discipline them appropriately and as consistently as you can. And you make the boundaries in the home very clear, and you communicate them clearly so that if they step over the line, they know exactly what they've done and that was something that there's going to be some consequences for. So one of the ways they have security is knowing exactly where the lane is, where they can swim, so to speak. But you never humiliate them. My dad told me when he was growing up that somebody got out of line, and they sometimes would take people and put a dunce cap on their head and put them over in the corner. And you were humiliated in front of all your peers. That's terrible. That's not a way to discipline someone, by publicly humiliating them in the classroom. And I think we need to be careful not to humiliate them in our home in front of their peers. So if you're going to discipline your children, discipline them in private whenever possible. I remember there were times where something was going on and they were out of line and we walk in and Amy and Allison could tell, oh, we're caught, But we would send their friends home. Thank you for coming. You guys need to go home now. And then we would talk to our kids and revoke a privilege or do what we needed to do to deal with what had happened. And later on, they told us that they appreciated us, that they didn't get fussed at and never yelled at in front of their peers, and frankly, never yelled at all. I don't think there's ever a reason, unless there's a fire, for parents to yell at their children. Never. And you just have to decide you're not going to stoop to that. But that instead, you speak in a normal tone of voice, and that if they don't respond in a normal tone of voice, there are consequences. There are privileges revoked, or there are other things you've set up to demonstrate discipline. But you learn how to speak softly but carry a big stick. Such an important principle of good discipline. And you do it in private, and you never do it in a way that brings about some sort of humiliation. And unless they've done something to violate your trust, where you feel like you just have to, don't eavesdrop on their conversations. Don't open their mail that they get from their peers. Let them have a little drawer where they can keep their own notes, and they know that will be respected. You treat them with respect, and hopefully that will help them to see how they need to treat you with respect. So you practice the golden rule, and you talk respectfully to them and to your spouse in front of them. Don't yell at each other in your marriage and then be upset when your kids want to yell at you. You model before them how to communicate respectfully. That is huge. And you show honor to your own mother and father, because you are modeling before your kids when they see how you talk about your mom and dad or your in-laws, how they one day will treat you when they're out of the nest and they're dealing with you in your old age. And so you talk respectfully, even if they are difficult at times. Be very careful about overheard communication. It's 5 times more powerful than direct communication. And a lot of times it's not so much what's taught, but caught, just from watching the way you live and act, that makes the biggest impression on your children. And if they can see, though certainly you're not perfect and sometimes you make mistakes, that you're doing your best to live this kind of consistent, respectful life before them, then you would have earned their respect over time. And treat them to respect others. Insist they respect their siblings. And use sibling rivalry as a way to help them learn how to resolve conflict. And talk to them about how to deal with this One of the most important coping skills you can give your children in life is how to resolve conflict. And it starts at home when they're very young with their own siblings and playmates. So no yelling at their playmates. No disrespecting and name-calling of their playmates. We don't call each other petty kind of names in our family. Because in our family, we value God, and that means we value other people because God values every soul. And that's one of the reasons why good manners begin at home. That's Gail's statement that she makes over and over again. Don't just be polite and nice to the strangers who knock on the door or to the people at work. Your best politeness and your best manners ought to be toward your loved ones in the home. Why do we often treat strangers better than our own family members? Absolutely inexcusable to do that. And so, you teach your children to say, excuse me, and pardon me, and thank you, and you are welcome, and nice to meet you. And when you meet people, to look them in the eye and to shake their hand. Oh, but they're shy. Teach them to do it anyway. Role play with them at home. So when they're at the church building and they meet people, you look over at them, they know what to do. Role play at home and teach them how to have good people skills. Teach them to show respect for adults. One of the things Gail did when my kids were young that I really respected so much is she'd say, before you run off and start playing with your peers, your friends, you seek out some of the widows and you inquire of their welfare. And you kind of ask what you can do with them. And we would go to visit people, and we'd bring our girls with us, and they'd sing hymns to them. And they appreciated that visit from our kids a whole lot more than from Brent and Gail. Part of it because that kind of thing is so rare. But you need to teach our younger people to especially respect our widows and our widowers and our older folks who need the touch that only the young can give. Emily Post said, manners are a sensitive awareness of the feelings of others. If you have that awareness, you have good manners, no matter what fork you use. I like that. This is not about being stuffy, just following etiquette for etiquette's sake. This is about one of the ways you can be courteous. And it's kind of fun teaching your children this. When Amy was younger, 2, 3 years old, she'd get the manners mixed up, and she'd bump into somebody, and instead of saying, excuse me, she'd say, thank you. And then it's time to say thank you. Someone gives her a gift, and she'd say, excuse me. We had to say, Amy, thanks for trying, but that's the wrong word. Okay. And those are kind of fun moments. But after a while, it just becomes second nature. And isn't it so much more pleasant and nice to be around children who have been taught good manners? And a lot of those good manners start at home around the dinner table. Chew with your mouth closed, take small bites, ask to be excused. And as Jan Bader likes to say, don't be the one to eat the last cookie, right? That's good advice. Would anybody else like this, right? And as I mentioned, teach them to respect older people. You know, in the Asian culture, I'm told that the older you get, the more respect people give you. That's not the way it is here. We live in this youth cult where people are afraid to tell you how old they are, and they do everything they can to look younger, where the Bible says that the gray head was a sign of glory and respect. Leviticus 19:32, you shall rise up before the gray-headed and honor the aged, and you shall revere your God, for I am the Lord. There's a certain respect your children ought to have for all grown-ups, especially those that are older that have wisdom. And there's so much to be learned from older folks who I'm afraid in our culture are often just sort of ignored while everybody fusses over the young. It's just not right. Let's have a biblical culture, not an American culture. Leviticus 16:32, the gray head is a crown of glory. Who am I? I am a little thing with big meaning. I help everybody. I unlock doors, open hearts, dispel prejudice. I create friendships and goodwill. I inspire respect and admiration. Everybody loves me. I bore nobody. I violate no law. I cost nothing. Many have praised me. None have condemned me. I am pleasing to those of low and high degree. I am useful every moment of the day. Who am I? I am courtesy. And nothing is as inexpensive yet priceless as courtesy. Courtesy is the oil that makes otherwise difficult circumstances go smoothly because it just oozes of class. And sadly, so many young people don't have the class that comes from basic courtesy. So please, a part of all of this is take the time to teach your children good manners and start them young so it just becomes second nature. Stress the point is to be thoughtful and considerate, not to be stuffy or better than anybody else. Most of the rules of etiquette have to do with being courteous, opening the door for a woman. It's not about some sort of slam like she can't open the door on her own. It's an act of chivalry which is showing respect and honoring her as a woman. And I think Christian men would do well to bend over backwards, to be respectful and honoring and chivalrous of women in general, their wife in particular, and model that before their sons. I think it's also important to be real and be genuine. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. The idea of being pure is to be authentic, the real deal. We don't know much about Nathanael in the Bible, but when Jesus saw Nathanael, who would be one of the 12, he said, "Behold, here is a disciple without guile." I think that's what we all should be and aspire to be. Just genuine. You don't have pretenses. You don't have hidden agendas. You're just someone that is just trying to genuinely do the best they can with a good heart and conscience. So what does that mean? That means if you mess up as a parent, and you will frequently, I think the hardest part of parenting is consistency. And when you realize you've made a mistake, it's important to be real and humble and admit to your children that you made a mistake, that you blew it. Forgive our trespasses, even as we forgive those who sin against us. Use this as an opportunity to point them to a higher standard. Remind them that they are supposed to be obeying you in the Lord. And that if we ever tell you to do something that's wrong, we wouldn't not ever do that intentionally, but if we ever did, who do you follow? What God says or what mom and dad says? Teach them to say with confidence what God says, because your ultimate commitment is to them, not to any other, it's to God, not to any other human being. I remember we had a rule when my kids were growing up that they weren't supposed to jump up and down on the sofa, and they weren't supposed to jump up and down in the car. And so I love to take Amy with me, running errands and things like that, little father-daughter time. So I said, Gail, I'm going to run. I got some errands I got to take care of. Amy, would you like to come with Dad? She goes, yes, I would. I said, okay, go out there, hop in the car, and I'll be out there in a moment. So I take care of some things. I come out, and there's Amy jumping up and down on the front seat of the car, which is one of those things we taught them they're not supposed to do. And so I didn't follow that proverb we talked about today, where you're supposed to not make a conclusion until you make sure you get all the facts. To me, it was pretty clear. She was disobeying what she knew she wasn't supposed to do. So I go out there, and I was pretty upset with her. And I opened the door, and I said, Amy, what are you doing? You know you're not supposed to do that. She goes, but Dad. I go, but Dad, nothing. I gave her a swat on the rear end, when we talked, and I could tell something wasn't quite right. And, but Dad, you said go out there and hop in the car. Yes, I did, didn't I? Boy, I had really messed up. Here I had disciplined her for what I just told her to do. And so I remember going there, sitting in the car, looking over at her and saying, Amy, I was so wrong. Dad really messed up. I didn't realize, that's not what I meant. That was a expression that just meant get in the car, but I can see why you took it that way. I was wrong. Will you forgive me? Yes, Dad, I forgive you. And we kind of had a bonding moment. Because you always teach your children not just to say, I'm sorry, but I was wrong. Will you forgive me? It's just much more therapeutic and meaningful. And I think that actually helped our relationship a little bit. The rest of the day, she was fine. But it's so important to be humble. And when you mess up, admit it. When I occasionally realize I've messed up from the pulpit, I try to quickly acknowledge it and admit it and just be done with it. Because that's what we're supposed to do. Because we're just servants and we're not going to be perfect. And of course, obey double standards. A double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. I love Proverbs 11:3. The integrity of the upright guides them, but the unfaithful are destroyed by their duplicity. I think about when I read that proverb, a parent who says, don't do as I do, but do as I say. Just, I'm going to smoke, but you better not. That kind of stuff just breeds disrespect and rebellion. You're not supposed to use foul language, but I can. Children will see through that kind of hypocrisy, and rightfully so. And so do your very best to walk the walk and talk the talk. And we live in a society where everybody wants to be, just friends with their children. Be a parent, not a buddy. Your child has a whole lot of peers, but they only have one or two parents, right? And they need that parent to be an authority figure. And you need to focus on being respected in the long run, not being liked in the short run. Remember, we are to raise them up to a higher level, not lower ourselves down to their level. Train up a child. Someone says, I don't want to discipline my children because I love them so much. Translation, I have such low self-esteem, I can't stand even the short-term rejection discipline might bring. Love your children enough to give them discipline they need, even if they're really upset with you for a while. Because you try to do that consistently out of love, they are going to love you as an adult. Once they leave the nest, everything changes. Yes, they're still your children, but it's no longer parent-child dyad. It's friend to friend, adult to adult. And then you can have this wonderful adult friendship with your grown-up children. But while they're 5 years old or 7 or 10 or 15, forget that. It's not the dyad you want. You're the parent, they're the child, you're the authority figure. You be respectful to them, you love them, but you don't take any guff. And they'll grow up respecting that. It's so sad because most parents that are pushovers and are so afraid to discipline them because they don't want their kids to be mad at them. Think about it. Peers don't discipline peers, right? So if you try to be one of their peers, you can't really be in a position to discipline them. Almost always, those kids grow up disrespecting their parents throughout the rest of their life. They don't have a good relationship with them as adults because they weren't the parent that they desperately needed when they were kids. Proverbs 29:15. The rod and reproof give wisdom. The rod here is something that stands for corporal discipline. Reproof is instruction, explanation, so they understand why there's the punishment. So, particularly as your kids get older, it's not enough just to discipline them. You have to make sure, now, the reason why you're receiving this discipline or this privilege is being revoked or whatever it may be, is because this clearly stated boundary was violated. And you went ahead and did it anyway, and that's not acceptable. And so they need to know why. Things need to click in their head. Because one of these days, you're not going to be around, and you're trying to instill in them their own conscience that they'll have later. A child who gets his own way will bring shame to his mother or his father. Don't spoil your kids. Don't confuse love with self-indulgence. It's the exact opposite. In fact, the Bible says that if you love your child, you will discipline them. I'm basically running out of time. I'm going to skip that. He who spares the rod hates the son, but he who loves him disciplines him diligently. Let me ask you something. We live in a culture that, pretty much has disavowed any kind of even moderate spanking or corporal punishment. Certainly have taken it completely out of schools. Let me ask you something. Are we less violent as a culture or more violent since we have disavowed spanking as a culture? You know the answer to that. Now, spanking can be abused, it can be overused, but an appropriate spanking sometimes is very much in order. And sometimes, especially for a younger child that you can't really reason with yet very well, I think it's the most effective way to bring home the point. I saw this a while back. An Assemblyman, Sally Lieber. I think it's pretty hard to argue you need to beat a child. These social engineers have no clue what they're doing. There is a huge difference between a reasonable, modified spanking, say on the rear end or whatever, not abusive in any way, and to say that that's beating a child when you spank them appropriately. It's just so sad. Our society rightfully has responded to the abuse in discipline, but it's gone so far the other way, it doesn't even allow you in some ways to discipline in a respectful, appropriate manner. And finally, teach them to respect your word. The Lord detests lying lips, but he delights in those who are truthful. My dad used to always say, make promises sparingly and keep them faithfully. And if he told us he was going to do something, we could count on it. And he was very, very rare to make a commitment because he knew that if he said something, he needed to follow through. Is that the way it is in your home? Your word is an extension of who you are. What if you threaten or tell your kids you'll do something and then you don't follow through? That happens a lot. You break promises, you break trust, and you breed disrespect. There was a fellow in a congregation I preached at once. He got mad at his son, and he said, I'm taking away your computer for life. Really? For life? One parent said, I'm going to wring your neck. I'm going to, all these crazy stuff. No, you're not going to wring their neck. Don't say things you don't mean. Think about your words. Be careful. Be measured. This is a time where you act slowly but consistently. Okay. Next installment, next Sunday night, teaching versus training, how to keep your children under loving command. Thank you all for being here. I hope this was helpful. By the way, there's also a sheet of paper called the attitude chart, which is designed for parents to go over with their children at night, and where you have them rate their attitude toward their mother, dad, sister, friends, work, and bedtime. Then at the end of the week, they get a composite score. So they're always focusing in on what their attitude was. This is a self-evaluation, and it's just extremely helpful to keep any kind of disrespect or rebellion out of their heart. So I've got about 25 of those on the back table if any of you think that might be helpful. Okay, the invitation song is Sanctuary. Nick, go ahead and lead us. Thank you.
To be a sanctuary.